HOA Karen tries to tow my car from my driveway. The day started like any other. I woke up, brewed a cup of coffee, and stepped outside to get some fresh air. The neighborhood was quiet, the way I liked it. My car, a perfectly legal and well-maintained vehicle, sat in my own driveway, just like it had for years. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, until I noticed a figure standing at the end of my property, clipboard in hand. Karen, the HOA president. If you've ever lived in an HOA-controlled neighborhood, you know there's always that one person who takes their authority way too seriously. Karen was that person. She treated the HOA like her personal kingdom, and we were all just her subjects. I had managed to avoid her nonsense for the most part, but today, that was about to change. She strutted toward me, an air of self-importance surrounding her. "Good morning," she said, in that overly cheerful voice that never sounded genuine. "Morning," I replied cautiously. I already knew something was coming. She glanced at my car, then back at me. "We have a problem," she said, tapping her clipboard. According to HOA regulations, vehicles cannot be parked in driveways for extended periods. Yours has been here all week. I frowned. "Karen, this is my driveway. My car is registered to this address. I have every right to park here." She pursed her lips. "That may be, but the HOA has rules, and I've already scheduled a tow truck to remove it." My heart skipped a beat. "You did what?" She smirked. "They'll be here in an hour." I stared at her in disbelief. This wasn't just an overreach. It was downright illegal. But if she thought she was going to have my car towed without consequences, she had another thing coming. This was war. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Karen had overstepped before, but this was beyond petty rule enforcement. This was an outright abuse of power. I needed to act fast. I pulled out my phone and immediately dialed the non-emergency police number. There was no way she had the legal authority to tow my car from my own driveway. As I waited for the call to connect, Karen smirked, arms crossed like she had already won. "Oh, calling for backup?" she sneered. "I assure you, the tow truck is already on its way. HOA rules are clear." I ignored her and spoke calmly to the dispatcher. "Hello, I need to report an unauthorized towing attempt. My car is parked in my private driveway, and the HOA president has ordered a tow without my consent." The dispatcher responded swiftly. "That doesn't sound legal, sir. We'll send an officer to assess the situation." Karen's smug expression faltered slightly, but she kept up the act. "You're wasting your time," she huffed. "The contract we have with the tow company is airtight." I wasn't convinced. If there was one thing I knew, it was that HOAs didn't have absolute power, especially not over legally parked vehicles on private property. And I was about to make sure Karen learned that lesson the hard way. A few minutes later, I heard the low rumble of an approaching tow truck. Right on cue. But before they could even hook my car up, a police cruiser turned onto the street, lights flashing. Karen's face went pale. This was about to get interesting. Karen's confident smirk melted into a thin, anxious line as the police cruiser came to a stop right in front of my driveway. The tow truck had barely begun positioning itself when an officer stepped out of the car, adjusting his belt as he surveyed the scene. "Who's in charge here?" the officer asked, his voice firm but neutral. Karen stepped forward, clutching her clipboard like it was some kind of shield. "Officer, I'm Karen, the president of the HOA. This vehicle is in violation of our community guidelines, and I've called for its removal." The officer turned to me. "Is this your car, sir?" "Yes," I said, arms crossed. "And it's parked on my private driveway. I did not authorize a tow, nor am I in violation of any laws." The officer nodded and turned back to Karen. Ma'am, do you have legal authority to remove vehicles from private property? Karen stammered. The HOA rules clearly state that. I asked about legal authority, not HOA rules. The officer's tone sharpened. HOAs are not above the law. I could see the tow truck driver shifting uncomfortably, sensing the shift in power. He wasn't about to get into legal trouble over Karen's nonsense. "Hey man," he said, addressing me. "If you don't want your car towed, I'm not touching it." Karen's face turned a furious shade of red. "You were already paid for this job." The driver shrugged. "Paid or not, I'm not breaking the law." The officer exhaled. "All right, this is simple. Karen, you cannot tow vehicles from private property without a court order or the owner's consent. If you proceed, you'll be looking at serious consequences." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She wasn't used to being challenged. "Now," the officer continued, "I suggest you cancel this tow before you end up in trouble yourself." I watched with satisfaction as Karen struggled for words. She turned to the tow truck driver. "Fine, just go," she snapped. But the driver wasn't done. "Actually, lady, since you called us under false pretenses, you still owe us a service fee." Karen's face turned even redder. "What?" The driver smirked. "That's the policy. You wasted our time." As I stood there watching, it hit me. Karen's plan had completely backfired. Not only was my car staying exactly where it was, but now she was the one stuck paying the bill. Karma was sweet. Karen stormed off, her face red with frustration. But I knew this wasn't over. She had lost this battle, but she wasn't the type to back down easily. The HOA had been her little fiefdom for years, and she wasn't going to let one loss change that. But I wasn't done either. If Karen thought she could harass me, she had another thing coming. I opened my laptop and began drafting a formal complaint to the HOA board. I laid out everything: her abuse of power, her illegal towing attempt, and how the police had to intervene. If she wanted a fight, I was more than ready. As I hit send, a small smile crept onto my face. This war was far from over, and I was just getting started. I didn't have to wait long for a response. Less than 24 hours after submitting my complaint, I received an email from the HOA board requesting a formal hearing. The tides were shifting. The message was clear. Karen's actions had not only raised eyebrows, but had also made waves in the HOA. As I read through the email, I could practically hear the panic in the board's message. They didn't want to deal with any more drama. I could almost see them scrambling to avoid another scandal. The hearing was set for the following week. I was prepared. I spent the next few days gathering everything I needed: photos of my legally parked car, a copy of the police report, and a detailed account of the entire interaction. My case was strong, and I wasn't going to let this slip through the cracks. But the thought of sitting across from Karen in that meeting made my blood boil. She had no shame. Her sense of entitlement had led her to abuse her position, and now she was going to pay the price. I arrived at the HOA's office early on the day of the hearing, eager to make my case. The board members were already gathered, whispering amongst themselves. Karen sat at the front, her face tight with anger, trying to act as if she were still in control. I started with a simple question to set the tone. How can the HOA justify someone overstepping legal boundaries to remove a car from my private property? The room went silent. The hooks had been set. And now, Karen was about to face the consequences of her actions. It was my turn to take control. As the hearing began, I could sense Karen's desperation. She sat rigidly at the table, clutching her papers like a lifeline. I could tell she wasn't expecting this to go as far as it had, and the shock on her face was almost worth it. The board chairperson called the meeting to order, and Karen wasted no time jumping into her defense. "I followed the HOA guidelines," she said with a forced calmness. "My actions were in line with what's outlined in the community rules." I leaned forward, a knowing smile on my face. "Actually, Karen," I interrupted, "the guidelines don't allow you to tow vehicles from private property without the owner's consent. Not only that, but your actions were illegal, and the police intervened on my behalf." I saw Karen flinch, but she quickly regained her composure. She tried to play the victim, claiming she was only trying to enforce the rules of the community. But I wasn't buying it. The board wasn't buying it either. One of the members cleared his throat and addressed Karen. "Karen, we've reviewed the incident. It's clear that your behavior violated both HOA policies and basic legal standards. This cannot be tolerated." The room shifted. The power had changed hands, and now Karen was facing the consequences of her overreach. As the board discussed potential actions, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Karen had pushed too far, and it was finally catching up with her. It was my turn to shine in the spotlight. The tables had turned. The board's decision came swiftly. They voted unanimously to reprimand Karen, but that wasn't all. They also decided that she would be temporarily suspended from her position as HOA president. The look on Karen's face was priceless. It was as if the ground had shifted beneath her, and she was falling into an abyss she couldn't escape. She sat there, mouth agape, unable to form words, as the board chairperson read out their decision. For years, she had used her position to wield power over the residents, but now, that power had slipped from her grasp. "Karen, we have also decided to investigate the validity of your past actions as president," the chairperson continued. "Any further violations could lead to your permanent removal from the HOA." I could see the weight of the consequences sink in, and for the first time, Karen was speechless. She had no defense. She had pushed too hard, and now her reign was crumbling. As I left the meeting, I couldn't help but feel a rush of relief. The feeling of watching someone who had been a tyrant for so long finally face the consequences was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. The next few days were filled with whispers in the neighborhood. People were talking. Some were thrilled that Karen was getting her comeuppance, while others were simply relieved that the constant tension she had created was finally beginning to dissipate. But I knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The fallout from Karen's suspension wasn't just limited to her. As news of her downfall spread through the neighborhood, I began to hear from other residents who had felt the sting of her overbearing rule. One afternoon, as I was walking my dog, I ran into Mark, a neighbor who had been particularly vocal about the HOA's overreach. He had always been wary of Karen, and now, it seemed, he was ready to act. "I've been meaning to talk to you," Mark said, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "You did the right thing, standing up to her. The HOA needed someone to challenge her." I was surprised by his words. Mark was a quiet guy, usually keeping to himself, but his admiration was genuine, and it felt good to know that I wasn't the only one who had had enough of Karen's reign. "I've been collecting evidence of her abuse of power for months," he continued. "If we're going to take the HOA back from her, we need to get the rest of the neighborhood on our side." His words struck a chord with me. This wasn't just about one car or one woman's overstep. This was about changing the way the community operated, ensuring that power didn't fall into the wrong hands again. We agreed to meet the next day to discuss a plan. Karen might have been knocked down, but I wasn't done. There was more to do. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Mark and I began speaking with more neighbors, gathering stories of how Karen's actions had impacted their lives. From arbitrary fines to overbearing restrictions, it seemed that Karen had made her mark on every resident. It wasn't long before our small movement began to gain traction. People who had once been silent now stood up to share their stories. And soon, we were organizing a formal meeting to discuss the future of the HOA. The pressure was mounting. Karen had been dethroned, but her influence was still strong. She tried to rally her supporters, but the tide was turning against her. More and more people saw her for what she really was, a power-hungry leader who cared little for the well-being of the community. As we prepared for the meeting, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unity in the neighborhood. For the first time in years, it felt like the residents were in control of their own community. We weren't just fighting for my car anymore, we were fighting for the right to live without fear of arbitrary rules and power abuse. When the day of the meeting finally arrived, it felt like a turning point. Karen would either accept that her time had passed or try to claw her way back. I was ready either way. The night of the HOA meeting was electric with anticipation. The room was packed, every seat filled with residents eager to have their voices heard. Mark and I arrived early, prepared with our evidence and a clear plan of action. Karen, as expected, showed up with her usual air of arrogance, but it was clear she was rattled. The board had given her one last chance to defend herself, but the mood in the room had already shifted. The residents weren't on her side anymore. The chairperson called the meeting to order. Tonight, we will discuss the future of the HOA and the leadership moving forward, he began. There will be an open vote on whether Karen should remain in her position. The room buzzed with tension. Everyone knew this was the moment of truth. I stood up first, holding up the documentation we had gathered. Karen's behavior has harmed this community for far too long. We cannot allow her to continue in a position of power, I said, my voice strong and clear. Karen shot me a glare, but I wasn't intimidated. I wasn't the only one speaking out now. Neighbors began to stand, one by one, voicing their support for the changes we were advocating. The room was united. When the vote was cast, the result was undeniable. Karen was removed as HOA president, effective immediately. The room erupted in applause, and I couldn't help but grin. The battle had been long, but we had won. Karen slunk out of the room, defeated. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free. And as I walked out of the meeting, I realized that sometimes standing up for what's right can change everything.